But we appreciate having each of you with us here today. Today I want to take a look back in a sense. If you've read the bulletin, you see that part of the idea that I had in mind was that I would look at particularly something that I started last week. And one of the things that happens very often then when you start preparing sermons, you get into it and you discover that there is more material that you want to deal with than you actually have time to deal with on one occasion. No one is particularly willing to stay as they did for the Apostle Paul, let me speak till midnight, so consequently we have to make some changes in that regard. But today we want to deal in particular with a couple of items. First of all, though, we're going to look at the Roman letter, the 12th chapter, and verses 1 and 2. Brothers and sisters, in view of all we have shared about God's compassion, I encourage you to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, dedicated to God and pleasing to Him. This kind of worship is appropriate for you. Don't become like the people of this world. Instead, change the way you think. Then you will always be able to determine what God really wants, what is good, pleasing, and perfect. And of course, this is the transition that we anticipate will take place with an individual when they become a Christian. But in particular, today, one of the things I wanted us to take some time to look at was, we mentioned last time about the high priest and the fact that Christ was our high priest, that he had to be a man, had to be selected, as the Hebrew writing points out, and it's also from the 16th chapter of Leviticus. And in addition to that, he had to be approved by God. And of course, Christ qualified in both of these particular areas. But some of the things that we notice about this, and I want to point this out because this proves a parallel. In Hebrews 9:24-25, Christ didn't go into a holy place made by human hands. He didn't go into a model of the real thing. Instead, he went into heaven to appear in God's presence on our behalf. Every year, the chief priest went into the holy place to make a sacrifice with blood that isn't his own. However, Christ didn't go into heaven to sacrifice himself again and again. Under the Mosaic law, as you are aware, no doubt, it was necessary on a yearly basis for the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies, to take the blood of bulls and goats and go in and offer a sacrifice by sprinkling it on the horns of the altar, or on the mercy seat actually, and then he would lay his hands on the head of the scapegoat and he would be sent away. And in a sense, this would be a way of taking the sin of the nation of Israel away, or putting off the penalty for it. Because it wasn't possible that the blood of bulls and goats could pay for the sin that people had committed. And so this is the pattern that God had established, that the high priest would make a sacrifice for the people. And of course, the individuals also had to make their sacrifices. So all during the year, essentially individuals made sacrifices for the sins they committed. And then once a year, the high priest made a sacrifice for the entire nation. And what we will see is that did not change with the advent of the new covenant. That there was a high priest who would make a sacrifice, the people would continue to make sacrifices of their own, and that the final result would be to complete what God wanted to take place with individuals. In the 26th verse here in Hebrews 9, otherwise he have had to suffer many times since the world was created, but now at the end of the ages he has appeared once to remove sin by his sacrifice. And this, of course, is talking about Christ. And the fact that under the Mosaic law, it was necessary for the sacrifice to be made every year. But with Christ, Christ made the sacrifice once, and that was good for all. Christ was not going to be crucified over and over and over again to pay the penalty for the sin of mankind. So what we have then is, as we say, we're following the same pattern, but we're upgrading it, so to speak, and making it more effective and more efficient. In the Hebrew letter, again, looking at still in the 9th chapter, but going back to verse 12, he used his own blood, not the blood of goats and bulls, for the sacrifice. He went to the most holy place and offered this sacrifice once and for all to free us forever. And so when Christ died, of course, his sacrifice, the shedding of his blood, was to take away the sin of all of mankind. In other words, from Adam to the final individual that lives on the face of this earth. When Christ died on the cross, and as we pointed out last week about the severity of that death, he took away and took on himself, literally became sin in order to take away the sins of all of mankind. This doesn't mean that everyone has the benefit of that unless they avail themselves of the plan of salvation or the recognition of the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So Christ paid the penalty, but man has to do his part too. He has to make a sacrifice as well. And of course, that was what we were reading about in Romans, the 12th chapter. When an individual becomes a Christian, the sacrifice that we offer is ourselves. And we'll talk more about the degree of that sacrifice as we continue on. But in looking at and thinking about these things, there's not, as we said, going to be another sacrifice. So in verse 28 here in the 9th chapter of Hebrews, likewise Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of humanity. And after that he will appear a second time. This time he will not deal with sin, but he will save those who eagerly wait for him. In other words, Christ is coming back, and on the second trip, he's not coming back to be sacrificed again. He's coming back for the purpose of taking those who have obeyed the gospel with him. And as a result of that, they will be gone, for good. So, as we said, the same basic pattern that was followed under the Mosaic system is also followed in the Christian dispensation, of Christ being the high priest and making the sacrifices for us. So we look at these things and his blood being sacrificed and all of these things having been done for us. Now, that having been established, and hopefully you understand and grasp that, it shouldn't be too complex. The next thing we want to look at, and I want to take time, as we mentioned last week, about the humanity of Jesus. And I am totally convinced that none of us ever have really given serious thought to just how human Jesus was. I'm convinced that we see him basically as God wrapped up in a human body and yet retaining most of the abilities and the things that he would have had as God's Son. And yet I think if we take a careful look at what the scriptures tell us, we will see that that is a very wrong image that we have of Christ and who he was. In the 14th chapter of Mark, in verse 33, this is after the supper had been established and they'd gone out now to the Mount of Olives. He took Peter, James, and John with him and began to feel distressed and anguished. It's interesting when you look at this in the language, because the wording is it's hard to believe almost when you think about it because of the way we think about this. But what we find there as we look at this it's translated either as mentally distressed and in one instance horrified. And I think what we have here, if you think about it, is Jesus was human. Jesus knew when he came he was going to die on the cross. And he knew that that was going to be bad. But I try to parallel this in my own mind with thinking about, as I've mentioned so many times before, about my love for going to see the dentist. I know when I have a dental appointment that it's not going to be fun. Never is. But by the same token, when it's 6 months away, I don't really worry too much about it. It doesn't really go through my mind all that much. But on the morning of the day that I'm going to be there, then it really gets my attention. Because then it comes home with reality. Because I'm human. And I think this is precisely what we are being shown about Jesus. During the 33 years of his life, he knew that he was going to go to the cross. He knew that. It was not like the movies like to portray that somehow or other he sort of somewhere along the line stumbled across the fact that he was God's Son. He knew who he was, and he knew what he was going to face. But when it came to the time that he was in the garden, he knows it is now. And he is horrified because he knows what it's going to be like on that cross and what he's going to have to endure. So here is humanity coming in. And you stop and think about it. He's going to be our representative. He's going to be the one that pleads our case before God. Could he do it if he had never been to the places that we have been? And the answer is he couldn't. So he had to be as human as you and I. Certainly he had knowledge beyond what we have. But he was flesh and blood. When he stuck a splinter in his finger, he felt it too. And when they nailed him to that cross, he felt every bit of it when they drove those nails through his hands and feet. This was not just something simple that could happen. But Matthew also, in writing about it in the 26th chapter, then he said to them, my anguish is so great that I feel as if I'm dying. Wait here and stay awake with me. So all of these passages of Scripture and the language that's contained in them say that Jesus felt this about to the as high a degree as it's possible to explain in language. He felt like he was literally dying there in the garden. And he asked his friends to stay with him, his apostles. In the 14th chapter of Mark, again in verse 36, he said, Abba, Father, you can do anything. Take this cup of suffering away from me, but let your will be done rather than mine. And also in Matthew 26:39, after walking a little farther, he quickly bowed with his face to the ground and prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, but let your will be done rather than mine. Do you really see what he's saying here? Jesus is saying, I don't want to do it. He says, it's your will, Father, it's not mine. I don't really want to do this. I know what I'm facing. And to put it in terms that we might understand, I'm scared. I don't want to do this. And I think most of us have been in places like that, where there was something that we knew was going to happen, but we did not want it to do. We did not want to do it. We didn't want to go there. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I don't want to do this. And it's your will, Father. It's your will that I do this, but it is not my will that I do this. In the 26th chapter again in verse 44, after leaving them again, he went away and prayed the same prayer a third time. So 3 times in the garden, Jesus asked his Father let's not do this. I don't want to do it. And we don't normally think about that with Christ because we know he came here to suffer and to die that we might have the forgiveness of sin. But if you'll think about it again, you'll realize that in order to really be a human being, to really understand you and I, he had to have this kind of feeling also. To know what it was like to face something that you did not want to face, and that you had to overcome your own fear and the pressure that you felt as a result of this. And the Hebrew writer in the 5th chapter gives us the answer. Although Jesus was the Son of God, he learned to be obedient through his sufferings. So what happened with Jesus in the garden? He said, Father, 3 times, I don't want to do this. But what he said was, it's your will, I'll do it. So this is a clue for you and I in the life that we live day by day. That we have things that we are to do as Christians and we say, you know, I really don't want to do that. But if I'm going to do what the Father wants me to do, I have to do it anyway. There are things that that we don't like doing in this life and that we try to avoid. But the reality is we don't have a choice. We have to do it. In Philippians 2 and verse 8, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, death on a cross. Jesus was willing to be humiliated as he was on the cross, to suffer all that he did because it was his Father's will that he do it. And he knew he was doing it for us. He knew that there was a price that he was paying for us as well. But he was suffering there much like you and I would suffer if we were faced with a similar type situation. And that's, once you begin to think about Jesus in this standpoint and realize just how human he really was, that he was not somebody that was just sort of there and sort of experienced these things and that just sort of went through it. But it was very real for him. In 1 Timothy 1, 15 and 16, this is a statement that can be trusted and deserves complete acceptance. Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and I am the foremost sinner. However, I was treated with mercy so that Christ Jesus could use me, the foremost sinner, to demonstrate his patience. This patience serves as an example for those who would believe in him and live forever. And so now we have to think of Christ from the standpoint that as our high priest now, he understands us. And he's gone to heaven to represent us before his Father. How much patience do you think he should have toward us when we refuse to do the things that he has asked that we do in order to be pleasing to him, but that we choose rather to do what we want to do and basically say, I don't really care that you suffered as you did. I'm going to do it my way, which is basically what we say a lot of the time. And so, as Paul says here, Paul says, I'm the foremost of sinners. And again, think about Paul. He was the man, of course, that had the responsibility in the first century, essentially, of destroying the church. And if you read carefully in the book of Acts, you'll see that Paul was doing an excellent job. He was being very effective. He was damaging the church severely. And with the enthusiasm and all that he demonstrated. But with his conversion, he was just as enthusiastic in the opposite direction. In the 2 Corinthians letter, the 11th chapter, is a passage that most of us are familiar with, in verses 23 through 27. Are they Christ's servants? It's insane to say it, but I'm a far better one. I've done much more work, been in prison more times, been beaten more severely, and have faced death more often. 5 times the Jewish leaders had me beaten with 39 lashes. 3 times Roman officials had me beaten with clubs. Once people tried to stone me to death. 3 times I was shipwrecked and I drifted on the sea for a night and a day. Because I've traveled a lot, I've faced dangers from raging rivers, from robbers, from my own people, and from other people. I've faced dangers in the city, in the open country, on the sea, and from believers who turned out to be false friends. Because I've had to work so hard, I've often gone without sleep, been hungry and thirsty, and gone without food and proper clothes during cold weather. Now this is just part of what Paul categorizes. There are catalogs here. And the point to me is, think about this. Paul considered himself the chief of sinners. Paul had done the things that he had done to destroy the church. And yet in the catalog of the things and the events and the things that were suffered by men, and this of course is not all that Paul had to endure, is there a parallel between his persecution of the church and the things that he endured? And I think that when you stop and consider this and think about it, that perhaps Paul realized that the price that he paid as a Christian was somewhat commensurate with the price that he had, the damage that he has done to the cause of Christ. And I don't know that that's true. I don't know if that's a good parallel to draw or not. But I think about this and think about the fact that if I as a sinner have done the things that I have done and have hurt the cause of Christ, is perhaps the things that I have to endure in my life just a minor indication of the fact of the damage that I have done and the mistakes that I have made. And I realize that this is, a lot of people have thought about this kind of thing and thought about it in a way that this was sort of a retribution type thing, and I don't know that it is. But I know this, that along with Paul, I can say that I'm a sinner. And I can see, as I look at it and think about it, that the fact that I have done these things was not done because I didn't think I was doing wrong at the time. I thought pretty well most of the time that things I did were done the right way. But I do know in looking back at things in my life that there were mistakes that I made. And like Paul in Acts 23 and verse 1, Paul stared at the Jewish council and said, "Brothers, my relationship with God has always given me a perfectly clear conscience." How often have we done what we have done in our lives with a perfectly clear conscience? And yet, in time and as situations have developed, recognize that what we had done was not what would be acceptable to the Lord at all. But just like Paul, we did it with a clear conscience. In Philippians 3 and verse 6, he says the similar thing. When it comes to being enthusiastic, I was a persecutor of the church. When it comes to winning God's approval by keeping Jewish laws, I was perfect. In other words, Paul said he was perfect at doing the things that he did. Persecuting the church, he was perfect at it. He was getting the job done. He was casting people into prison and having them killed. All of what he believed was right. And so this is an indication to me that we need to think very, very carefully about what we do and what we say. Because we can be totally convinced that what we're saying and doing is exactly what the Lord wants. But it may not be. We may be on the wrong path altogether. We may be following the wrong direction and doing things that are not at all what the Lord would have us to do. So I think we can take the ideas that I've given to you today and we can make application of them to our lives if we want to. But the question that we really face is, do I really want to think about things in this way? Or would I really like to continue to think that Jesus was just sort of God wrapped up in a man's clothes and was just sort of a observer while he was here and didn't really endure anything, and that my life has pretty well been what it should be and it will be all right. In Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, brothers and sisters, in view of all we have just shared about God's compassion, I encourage you to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, dedicated to God and pleasing to Him. This kind of worship is appropriate for you. Don't become like the people of the world. Instead, change the way you think. Then you will always be able to determine what God really wants, what is good, pleasing, and perfect. We read that at the outset. And I think that's what we need to observe. What have we learned in becoming Christians? And what have we sacrificed? What have when we talk about sacrifice, part of the time, and a lot of times in the thinking of people, they say, well, it's a sacrifice for me to make a contribution on Sunday mornings, to put some money in the plate. That's a sacrifice. Is it really? Or do we just sort of just give whatever we happen to have available or whatever, If I'm supposed to devote some of my time to doing what the Lord would have me to do, and I sacrifice my Sunday mornings to come and to be present for the worship service. I make that sacrifice. Is that a sacrifice? Or are we just sort of thinking about this in a sort of a general way that's beneficial to us. I'll read what Paul had to say about his sacrifice. Philippians 3, verses 7 and 8. These things that I once considered valuable, I now consider worthless for Christ. It's far more than that. I consider everything else worthless because I'm much better off knowing Jesus Christ, my Lord. It's because of him that I think of everything as worthless. I threw it all away in order to gain Christ. Paul gave up the life that would have put him in a very prominent position. If you consider carefully the position that he was in as the persecutor of the church, Paul was on his road to be one of the leading men in Israel. He had one of the best educations you could get at that time. He was a rising star among the Jews. He obviously came from a wealthy family because he was able to have, let's say, the best education that you could get at that time. And so what does he tell us in the Philippian letter here? I gave it all up. I got rid of it all because it was worthless. So the question is, what are we giving up? What is the price that we are paying for Christianity? And can we say with Paul that I know that it's all worthless, that what the world has to offer is really nothing, and that the only thing that is really important and that is real value is obeying Christ, becoming one of his brothers or sisters, and living my life for him. Amen. So we have one high priest who paid the price once and for all of us. And he learned to obey. And that's the challenge for you and I, to learn to obey, to live by the things that are contained in his word. Jesus sacrificed his own life and went through all that he did. And Paul sacrificed his life because ultimately, of course, he died in Rome. We don't know the precise information about it, but history tells us that he did. And so, in spite of all that he suffered and all that he endured and all that he did for the cause of Christ, he still had to suffer a lot of things physically and emotionally. And so, when we think about what we have had to face as Christians, it really turns out to be that we have had a very easy go of it, actually. We've never really been challenged. And perhaps before our lives are over, we really will face a challenge, and we will really and truly have to make a choice of what we're going to do and the direction we're going to travel. And so today, there's a challenge as well. And we'll make a decision today about whether we want to obey Christ by being buried with him in baptism and raised to walk in the newness of life, having our sins taken away, as Romans 6, 3 and 4 tells us. Or if we are in need of the prayers of the church in our behalf, if there are those situations in our lives that need to have brethren pray for us, we need to take advantage of that, as James tells us we might. So if you're subject to the Lord's invitation today, we invite you to let it be known. Come as we stand and as we sing.